All right. Well, good afternoon, folks, with the blustery weather that is here in March. But thank you for joining us today for our conservation webinar series. Today, we're going to be diving into the bats of Iowa, updates and suggestions for landowners. We've got with us Russ Benedict, a professor of biology at Central College. For those of you that are tuning in for the first time, feel free to submit your questions at any time in the chat. And those of you that have joined us for previous ones, you know the drill on getting those submitted, and we'll open up the floor for Q&A following Dr. Benedict's presentation. So with that, the virtual floor is all yours.
All right, great. Thank you very much. So again, as Liz said, I'm Russ Benedict, and I'm a biology professor. I've been here at Central College. This is my towards the end of my 23rd year now. Prior to that, my dad was in the military. So when everybody asks, where are you from? My smart aleck reaction is normally everywhere because we moved constantly. But I moved to the Midwest, I don't know, somewhere around junior high or so. And I'm going to tell you a little bit about one of my favorite groups of organisms. So I've been a nature lover basically ever since I can remember that, and kind of really got hooked on birds when I was in sixth grade, and I'm still a big lover of birds now. But I had gone out on a field trip for a class, and so this was, I think, 87, 88, somewhere along those lines. I had just started my master's degree, and it was one of those things. You're required to go out on this field trip, and it's a requirement for the class. I remember grumbling, I didn't want to go, but I went, and we went out and we caught bats. And within about those 2 hours, essentially, I knew this was something I was going to do for the rest of my life. And now here we are approaching 40 years later, and I'm still doing it. So they're really just amazing little critters, and I just want to give you a little bit of hint as to kind of what's so amazing about them. Who do we have here in Iowa? What are the population trends that we see in Iowa bats, and then a little bit on in terms of what individual landowners can do. Okay, so theoretically, you're now seeing kind of my main title slide there. If you have any kinds of questions for me, there's a couple of times throughout the talk where you'll see my email down there at the bottom. So Benedict R at Central. So this is one of my favorite little dudes. This is the Indiana bat sitting on my hand. And so one of the interesting things about bats is what most people encounter with a bat is a bat in their house. And that tends to startle you. But if you have the chance to meet them outdoors, kind of out in their world, I think you'll find they're very different little critters. They're just incredible charisma, incredible beauty, at least if you can kind of understand why they are built the way they are. Okay, so what I want to do is just a little bit here. So ordinarily I give this talk to like live audiences, and so people are hurling answers out at me. But I have some questions here for you. And so just kind of answer these in your heads. And so my first question is, if we look around the world, how many different kinds of bats are there? Okay, got that answer figured out in your head. The answer is about 1,400 different species. So in fact, almost 20% of all mammals are bats. So that is an enormous number of species to be found around the world. Okay. Now the answer to that question is actually a little bit fuzzy because there's a lot we don't know about nature. And in fact, especially the more genetic work we do on bats, the more species we find. So every day you look at this, that number goes up a little bit. Okay, so 1,400 different species of bats around the world. How many of them are here in Iowa? And the answer to that a little bit depends on how you answer the question. There are 9 that are regular residents, and then another 2 that just periodically pop into the state from time to time, especially late summer. Okay, so now next question. Which mammals are the closest relatives of bats? It's pretty common to hear people refer to bats as mice with wings or rats with wings. So is that accurate? And the answer to that is no, that's not accurate. The closest relatives are what these little dudes that we call shrews, and you've probably heard of a shrew before. And we have we have a couple of different species of shrews here in Iowa. They're actually pretty common, and they're about the size of a mouse, but they're unrelated to mice at all. And so yeah, bats are not flying mice. If you want to call them a flying shrew, that's okay. Okay, now most bats are very small. So you're hopefully seeing a picture now of this is actually my mentor holding a bat. And this is a small bat, but not dramatically small. So we have a bat here in Iowa that is this size, and then we've got like another four species that are just a hair bigger than this. So bats are small, but they play enormous roles in ecosystems. I mean, literally huge roles. So here is your next set of questions. What are the important roles that bats play in ecosystems? And the one that people generally can get right away is that one. They are major predators of night flying insects. But on top of that, especially if you head down into the tropical regions, very important pollinators. There's a whole bunch of crop plants that are pollinated almost exclusively by bats. And then out in nature, the guess is maybe 10%, maybe 30% of all plants down in the tropics are pollinated primarily by bats. So major impact there. And then our third role is they're also really important seed dispersers. There's a bunch of fruit-eating bats, and they eat the fruit, and then the poop comes, either they regurgitate it or it comes out the other end. But either way, they've almost always moved it away from the parent plant. So really important in terms of regenerating forests in areas where they have been logged. So really big players. And we're actually seeing this kind of play out right now as bats decline rapidly. We're seeing these kinds of things change. So here is just our overall look at a bat. I want to make sure you can see my cursor. So I often describe them as being built. I'm going to show my age a little bit here. The Terminator. You ever see that movie, The Terminator, with Arnold Schwarzenegger? So before he was a governor, he was a bodybuilder and just had this enormous upper body and then tiny little hips. That's what a bat is. So enormous upper body. So these huge muscles to power the wings. So both muscles of the chest and then muscles of the back. And so in general, somewhere in the 30 to 50% of their body weight is in those flight muscles. And you can really see it when you've got a bat highlighted up against the sun like this guy is right here. But then tiny little hip muscles, okay? And one of the interesting aspects of them is they've actually rotated their back legs. Their back legs have rotated about 180 degrees relative to what yours do. So their knees actually bend the opposite direction than your knees do. But the other thing you can see, and kind of the obvious star of the show when it comes to bats, is they've dramatically modified those forelimbs. Their arms are really modified. And take a look at their humerus. So there's their humerus, their upper arm bone, about the same dimensions in relation to their body as yours is. But now here is the forearm here. So notice that their forearm is about double the length of the humerus. Look at your forearm. It's about the same length as your humerus. But then look at the fingers. So this is the palm of the hand right here. There's the thumb sticking up. This is the pinky coming down. There's the ring finger, then the middle finger and the index finger sit right next to each other. But the look at the pinky. I mean, the pinky is longer than the forearm is. And then the index finger, if you could see all the way to its end, it's way out here off the end of the slide. So the index finger and the middle finger are almost double the length of the forearm. So huge long fingers, a long forearm, and then kind of a standard size humerus. And then you encase it all in this thin sheet of skin. That thin sheet of skin now connects to the back legs and includes the tail as well. You can see blood vessels out in there. These parallel strips here are little strips of muscle, so they can control each wing individually compared to the other one. You'll see they occasionally get little holes popped in their wings, but they'll heal those up. And then the other thing you'll notice here is the flap of skin that connects the two back feet and then encloses the tail. That's what's called the tail membrane. Excuse me, I'm choking up here. So the tail membrane is used as a rudder to help them steer when they're flying, but they can also curl it up into a cup-like shape or even roll it all the way up like a window screen. And so they'll catch insects in there. The majority of insects actually get caught in the tail membrane and then transferred to the mouth. Okay, so there's your kind of overall design of a bat. Now, our next picture just shows a little bit of the variations that you see on that general theme. And so here is a bat that is missing a tail membrane. This is a guy down from the tropics. So not only is it missing a tail membrane, but it's got a really long snout, and its tongue is so long that it can't put the tongue all the way back in the mouth. This is a nectar and pollen feeder. So they hover in front of flowers and project that snout and then the tongue down into the flower to get at the nectar and pollen. And since they're not catching insects, they don't really need a tail membrane. And if you recall, I said you can individually control the right and left wings relative to each other. That's how they steer. So they don't even really need the steering impact of a tail membrane. Now, the main thing about these two, I just want you to compare these two bats to each other. So notice we've got short, broad wings here, and then, whoops, come back here. And then we've got long, skinny wings there. Um, and that's largely a matter of what kind of habitat you live in. The guy in the top there, which is the Townsend's big-eared bat, that lives in really cluttered environments, flies in and among the tree branches. It's actually listening for the sound of caterpillars chewing. So phenomenal maneuverability, but not much in the way of speed. The guy down on the bottom, if you've ever been to Carlsbad Caverns and watched the bats coming out, that is the Brazilian or Mexican, you'll hear either name, Brazilian or Mexican free-tailed bat. They will cover 100, 200 miles a night, and they're doing all their flying up at 1,000 feet above the ground. So you really don't need maneuverability when you're that high up in the air, but what you need is efficiency, speed and efficiency to try and find these widely scattered patches of insects. So just different designs in terms of are you covering a long distance or a short distance? Okay, now let's talk just a little bit about our 9 local species. We're not actually going to talk about all 9. I want to mention a little bit about the 9 that you're likely to, or at least not 9, the subset that you are likely to come in contact with. Okay, so bat number 1, I often do this in a crowd. I just say, okay, everybody raise your hands up in the air. And then what I do once everybody's hands is up in the air, as I say, how many of you have seen a big brown bat? Because big brown bats are super common. If you've seen bats in buildings, 90% of the time, 85, 90% of the time, you've seen big brown bats. Now, they're not very big, and so people get confused by that. But nonetheless, this is a super common bat. The guess is this is also a billion-dollar bat. A lot of the insects that it eats are agricultural pests, and so the thought is this species alone is valued at least $1 billion a year. And then, as I mentioned earlier, they often are found in buildings too. Okay, the little brown bat. This is another one that you'll occasionally see in buildings. In the southern parts of Iowa, so basically the southern half, it's fairly uncommon. But by the time you get into the northern half of Iowa, it's much more common, especially if you're near water. So if you know of a building somewhere near a river or a lake, and if that building has hundreds, if not thousands of bats in it, that's almost certainly little brown bats. These guys are declining fast. We'll talk about this a little bit here in a few seconds. This thing, what we call white nose syndrome. And in fact, they've declined so much that they're being reviewed by the US government to be considered as either an endangered or a threatened species. And that ruling should come out here any day now. Okay, so that's the little brown bat. And their body weight is about half the weight of a big brown bat. Their wingspan's actually not vastly different, but their body size is quite a bit smaller. Okay, if you've heard of the endangered bat in Iowa, then you've heard of this guy. So this is the Indiana bat. This guy is found almost entirely south of I-80, and they are one of the bats that kind of combines hibernation and migration together. So they will be arriving in the state. I saw the flashing down below. Somebody was asking about when Indiana bats arrive. They'll arrive generally mid-April, late April, somewhere in that range. At least that's when the majority of them show up. A handful show up early in early April, but mostly mid to late April. They do their thing here in summer, raise their babies here, and then about, I don't know, about October 1 or so, they head back south, and they're going down to caves in Missouri and Arkansas, and they're going to hibernate in those caves. So they do both hibernation and migration. This guy roosts almost entirely in standing dead trees, especially a dead tree that has peeling bark on it. So it was listed as an endangered species back in the 70s. The original decline was probably related to insecticide use, but we don't really know it that well. But now it appears to be further declining because of white nose syndrome. So this is a bat, like I said, we'll talk about white nose here in a second. This is a bat I've done a lot of work on. I catch them. We put little orange wing bands on them that we get from the Fish and Wildlife Service. And then sometimes I'll put radio tags. So this guy has a radio transmitter on it. And I just saw right there, Indiana bats, so they roost in cottonwood trees. And the answer to that is any standing dead tree with peeling bark, yes, they'll roost in. Now, some kinds of trees hold their peeling bark for longer than others. And so I don't specifically know the story with cottonwoods. I know I have not, and I don't know if I've ever tracked one to a cottonwood. So my guess is if they're using cottonwoods, it's probably for a short period of time until the cottonwoods shed all that dead bark. Because yeah, once the tree has no dead peeling bark on it, then the bats don't use them anymore. At least Indiana's don't. Okay. Here's another guy. This guy was just recently listed as federally endangered. This is the northern long-eared bat. This guy, Joe Public will rarely see this because it hangs out almost entirely in in forests, especially bigger forests or forests with lots of mature trees. They eat insects, but they're also interesting because it's the only Iowa bat that sometimes eats non-insects, and that is they'll pull spiders out of their webs. When I first got to Iowa, we'd catch 2 to 4 of these guys a night, and now we're lucky if we catch 2 to 4 a summer. These guys have dramatically declined. Okay, just a second here. Now, this picture is basically my question for you is that a pretty scene? Are standing dead trees a pretty scene? And to a bat biologist, they absolutely are. So this is a standing bur oak up in Humboldt, Iowa. And we had tagged a whole bunch of northern long-eared bats with those radio tags. And if you see the peeling bark up here, and there's a little gap right there. Out of that gap, we watched our bat with the radio tag came out right at sunset, and then about another 25 or so bats then also came out with it. And bats always roost together, so those were almost certainly other northern long-eared bats. But what's interesting is if you hang out for very long underneath a standing dead tree right at sunset, you're going to see lots of activity. Insects, mice, frogs, tree frogs often get up and live in cavities in dead trees. So standing dead trees are really valuable to wildlife. Okay, this is another one that you're likely to see, the eastern red bat. Roosts out in the leaves of trees, and they're very common just like in suburban areas. So if you're out at evening and you see a bat flying around and you think to yourself, that guy looks like he's reddish colored, and then you're right. You're seeing an eastern red bat. Okay. These guys are mostly moth eaters, but they'll eat a variety of other insects too. But because they roost out in the leaves of trees, they're exposed to colder temperatures than other bats. So they have tons of fur. I don't know if you could see this, but the fur extends way out under the wings, which the other bats we were looking at didn't have. And then the tail membrane, the backside surface of the tail membrane is entirely covered with fur. So these guys, yeah, really are designed to handle nasty weather. And interestingly enough, these guys also migrate out of the state. But many of them will migrate down not too far away, central Missouri or so. They crawl down into the dead leaves on the soil surface and they hibernate there. Now, we think some of them hibernate in other places as well, but it's interesting to think that a bat would be hibernating underneath dead leaves. Okay, here is the hoary bat. And I throw this guy in mostly because this is the largest species of bat in Iowa. So a big female will have a wingspan. It's kind of hard for you to tell, but of about 18 inches or so, which is a big bat. And in the bat world, females are almost always larger than males. They're almost always 10, sometimes 20% larger than males. So this is our biggest local species. They're also long distance migrants. These guys will leave the state in somewhere in September or October, and they'll end up spending the winter down on the Gulf Coast or even out onto the islands in the Caribbean. Some of them down into Central America. So very long flying bat. These guys are there's a number of species that impact wind turbines. They fly into them, and it causes high rates of mortality in some species. And so this is one of the species that's actually rapidly declining because of collisions with wind farms. And the thought is, the story that we're hearing is that the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service is going to be considering these guys for listing as either threatened or endangered in the future. That's how far their populations have crashed. These are high flyers, so I tend not to catch very many of these. Now, one of the dudes that I didn't show you a picture of is this guy called the evening bat. And the evening bat is one of the little brown kinds of bats, kind of hard to tell apart from the other ones. But the story with evening bats is they're rapidly expanding in distributions. Their populations are increasing, and they're shifting north and occupying areas of the Midwest that they didn't used to occupy. So I've listed a couple of these bats that are declining, but there actually are a couple of bats who are doing pretty well. Okay, now let's talk a little bit about white nose syndrome. So, white nose syndrome is caused by a fungus, and this fungus is European, and it was accidentally brought to the United States, and we think it was probably brought by cave explorers, people who were exploring caves. And it impacts bats while they are hibernating. And more or less what it does, this is a bit of an oversimplification, but it does the job. It wakes them up. It invades their skin, the fungus does, their wings, their ears, their nose. So here's a bat you can see with white, kind of like cotton there on the nose. And as it eats away at the skin, that itches. And so that wakes the bats up. And because they're trying to hibernate and trying to make that fat last as long as they can, waking up over and over again is not a good thing. And so this kills lots and lots of bats. Here in the state, you can see it up on the slide. Biggest impacts are on Indiana bats, little brown bats, northern long-eared bats, and then one of the other guys we didn't talk about, the tricolored bat. Okay. White nose syndrome was first discovered in Iowa in January of 2015. In fact, that's what this picture is. This is a bat I took a picture of from a cave that this was the first bat in Iowa that was confirmed with white nose syndrome. In some of these caves, these big hibernating caves, it kills almost everybody. And so you'll occasionally see pictures like what you see there, just piles of dead bats. And so we know that millions of bats have died from this. And one of the things we're kind of curious about is how is that going to impact ecosystems? Bats are so poorly known, it's kind of hard to know that. But a recent paper came out that kind of gives us a hint that there's going to be big impacts. And so I can, well, the reference for this paper is on there. But basically, just the real fast summary of this paper. As white nose syndrome, the fungus, arrives in a county, what this researcher found was, not surprisingly, the bat populations decline. As bat populations decline, the use of insecticide by farmers increased. And in fact, it increased so much that then farming revenues actually declined. And across the eastern half of the United States, they declined by about $1 billion per year. But then here was kind of the real surprise, is as the fungus invades a county and bats decline and insecticide use increases, infant mortality in humans actually increases. And he didn't exactly know what was causing that. He suspected maybe something to do with particular insecticides that were being used. But one of the powers of this paper was every time white nose syndrome moved to a new county, this whole thing played out over and over again in a pretty consistent pattern. So that's showing us the kind of the economic impact of bats. It's showing us the way bats and insects are kind of interconnected across ecosystems. So very interesting stuff. Okay, now I'm going to have to just fly through this. Has white nose syndrome impacted Iowa bats? The answer to that is in basic yes. I'm just going to zip through this. This was a project I did with U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service and Iowa DNR. And more or less what this is saying is we went back to places where we'd caught lots of bats in the past, and we tried again recently. And so just pay attention to our column over here on the right. So our research over the last couple of summers has shown that big brown bats have increased by about 84% since we did this original work. Eastern red bats have increased, but now look at the declines in those three bats. Little brown, northern long-eared, and Indiana have drastically declined in the state. So really pretty stunning levels of decline. Okay, now quick note here on wind turbines. Wind turbines, basically bats fly into them. And there's more to the story than that. But every turbine that's been surveyed before has at least some mortality. And again, we know that some bats are really pretty strongly impacted by this. There's quite a bit of research that shows that we can use turbines in a different way that slows down mortality, but nonetheless, we've got to do something here, because this is I love wind energy. Don't get me wrong, but we've got to do something to make changes. And there are, like I said, there's some research. We know what to do here. We just need to do it faster than what we're doing. Okay, now quick notes on here are some of the things that landowners can do. One of the most important. So here's a picture of Curtis, and Curtis is standing next to a tree, and the top of that tree has bark on it. That tree had about 60 or 70 Indiana bats, a federally endangered species, and it also had evening bats, about 30 of those. So big thing. Don't clear dead trees. If you can let the dead trees stand, then let them stand. If you must clear them, please, please, please clear them in winter. Wait until after Halloween or so, and then before April 1st, and clear them in that winter window. If you clear them during the summer, you may be bringing down baby bats with you. Okay. If you're out and doing a bunch of like tree stand improvement, trying to thin out forests, think about girdling some of the trees, trying to kill them so that they're still standing, because you can then create this standing dead trees with peeling bark that a lot of bats use. Okay, minimize insecticide use. And then this is it's so easy to write, but man, it's so much work. If you've got some of these invasive species that are in your forest, if you can get them out of there, so things like autumn olive and honeysuckles, those actually have a negative impact on bats. And so if you can remove those invasive species, please do so. Now here's somebody, and this flashed up on the questions. Which bats are in your buildings? And that's actually a kind of an important question. So first of all, big brown bats all across the state, probably 80% of the bats that are in buildings are big browns. Okay. And they form what we call maternity colonies. So it's females and babies. But because big browns are super common and actually increasing in numbers, we don't really need to worry an awful lot about them. If a barn comes down that had big brown bats in it, that's sad, but you're not really going to hurt their populations. Okay. On the other hand, little brown bats also will use structures, especially in the northern half of Iowa. They also form breeding colonies in buildings, but their numbers are going down. And so, if you have little brown bats in your structures, I encourage you to think about protecting those. Now, here in a second, we'll get a little bit of an idea for how you might tell that apart. Now, Indiana bats are kind of a hard one. They rarely use buildings, but when they do, sometimes they're big breeding colonies. So if you have barns or other similar kinds of older wood structures in the southern to the south of I-80, and you know there's bats in there, try and figure out who they are, because just protecting a single colony of 400 Indiana bats can be a big deal based on how rare they are. Okay. Now here's all other species pretty darn rare in buildings. So really it's big browns and little browns with the occasional Indiana bat. Okay. But here's what I want you to do. Learn how to recognize bat poop. Okay. So pick up the poop, put it in your hand, rub it. If it doesn't break down, if it's just hard as a rock, that's mouse poop. Okay. But if it crumbles in your hand, it's bats. If it crumbles into your hands and it's like big shiny pieces, that's big brown bats. If it rubs into your hand and instead breaks down into almost what looks like sawdust, or kind of almost fibery, that's probably either little browns or Indianas. Okay, so if you are, especially if you're in the southern portions of Iowa, and you have what you think could be Indiana bats or little browns, then get in contact with me, because I can come out and take a look and see who you've got. Okay. But again, most of the case, it's going to be big brown bats. Big brown bats are super common, and we don't really need to worry an awful lot about their conservation. Okay. Now, just to quickly summarize here, because I'm just about out of time. So, great biology, really cool stories. Lots of species are declining. Some of them are actually increasing. So, lots of rapid changes in bat populations here in the Midwest. This white nose syndrome thing is an absolute nightmare. But there are things that you as a landowner can do. So again, there's my contact info. And then if you're interested in knowing a little bit more about the details of bats, I put out a paper written by me and some students. And if you just go on Google Scholar and just search for geographic and seasonal records Iowa bats, you'll find it. And so that gives you a lot of information about where bats live in the state and what time of year they do things. Okay, now I'm going to close with just a couple of pretty pictures here of bats from down in the tropics. The guy in the upper right, by the way, is a fish eater. He drags those long claws through the water to pull out little tiny fish. And then I just love this picture, because these are some of the bats that roost underneath leaves, these great big tropical leaves, and they clip the leaves so the leaves kind of collapse down, forming a tent. Then they roost underneath them. Okay, that is all I have for you. So now we will flip over to this, and I'm done with you.
All right, wonderful. We've got lots of questions coming in, so please continue to get those submitted in the chat. But if you did tune in today to get a CCA CEU, please send the following information on this slide. So your name, the name you entered to watch the webinar. If it's different than your registered CCA name and number, and then that CCA number. You can email that to Alena Whitaker, that's ALENAW, at iastate.edu by 5 o'clock today, and she will get that credit submitted on your behalf. And if you want to go ahead into the next slide, for those of you that have not seen this before, we would invite you to complete a voluntary demographic survey. Only one response is needed for all of our 2025 webinars. So if you've already completed it, thank you. You can either access it by scanning this QR code on the screen or searching or typing in iwillearningfarms.org/survey. It takes about 3 minutes, and we'd appreciate your feedback as a USDA funded program. And you can join us next week for an across the fence comparison of soil carbon storage on 22 farms with Ellie Ellis at Colorado State University. So join us then, again, 12 o'clock noon Wednesdays. And you can find this webinar and all of our previous webinars archived on our website. That's iwillearningfarms.org. You can also find us on YouTube, where you can find it by both year or topic. So if you're curious on a specific topic, you can easily do that. So let's jump into the questions, because there sure are a bunch of them. You're good.
Okay.
You can stop sharing if you'd like. We can just focus on questions here. Here we go. Okay, so you answered some of these, but one of these is, when we're sitting out by like an outdoor fire in the summer, they'll see bats flying overhead. Does the fire help attract the insects that the bats are catching? And kind of a secondary, which species of insects do the bats prefer? And maybe that varies by bat species, as you were discussing.
Right. Yeah, so that would be kind of my first level of answer, is that especially if you live like near really mature woods, you could potentially have all 9 species of bats living there. And each one of those is going to be feeding on different insects. Does the fire attract insects? Yes, but not huge numbers. Some of the different kinds of lights that people use in their houses, or especially outdoors, will attract more insects. But no, fires will occasionally attract insects, and bats tend to be pretty fearless. Once they're out and flying, essentially nobody can catch them, and so they're not shy about flying pretty close to you.
Yeah. So you talked about how to identify different bats by their poop. Because there's lots of questions here about, like, I have this bat or bats. How do I know which one it is? And related to that, so do you recommend using gloves when you're examining the bat feces?
Let's see. Should I give you the politically correct answer? So I never do, but I should. So yes, wear rubber gloves, because in honesty, how you rub it and you look wouldn't be impacted based on whether you're wearing gloves or not. So yes, wear some of those leather gloves. There's very little evidence of being able to share viruses or anything else through bat poop, but it's just safest and easiest to go ahead and wear gloves.
And there's quite a few questions in here, and I think it's something that we learn quite early about bats and rabies. Can you address that context of?
Okay, you bet. Yeah, so couple of things. First of all, rabies is essentially always fatal in humans. A couple of humans have survived it, but they've had massive problems. So think of it as, I don't want to mess around with this disease. Okay. Now, having said that, the vaccinations are super effective. And you've got a little bit of time from the moment you're exposed until when you have to start the shots. It's not like you have to sprint into your doctor right away. You've got several days or so before you have to get in and get shots. But because it's always fatal, if you think there's any chance you've been exposed, just go in and get the shots. Okay, it's not a big deal. I've gone through the shots several times myself. In the old days, they were painful shots in the stomach. They're not that anymore. They're just shots, is what they are. Okay, but the thing to know is that bats don't carry rabies any more often than other mammals do. There's kind of some rumors out there about half of all bats are rabid. That's not accurate. It's quite rare for a bat to have rabies. But when they do get rabies, they tend to get weak and fall to the ground, which means sometimes we humans encounter them. So if you find a bat laying on the ground, just leave it alone. There may be 500 different reasons it's laying there, but rabies is one of those. Okay, but if you disregard what I just said and you pick it up and you get bit, you must get the shots. Okay, it's that simple. You must get the shots. Okay, but the same story applies if a cat bites you, then you don't know the cat and you don't know if it's been vaccinated. Any mammal can carry rabies, and so therefore, anytime you get fluid to fluid contact with a mammal that you don't know, you need to think about rabies. Um, it's not something I panic about. It's just like, every disease. You once you know the stories and you take the appropriate precautions, then you're okay. But yeah, I had the whatever you call that. The initial booster or the initial shots when I got bit the first time. Then I had a booster. And now what I do is every 2 years, they do what's called drawing a titer, where they check my blood and see how good of immune response I have. And so even though it's been 20 years since I had my booster, I still have a very strong immune response. So once you get the vaccinations, you're good. Okay.
So there's a question here. What, if any, treatments are being developed for white nose syndrome?
There's research on several different treatments. So the fungus gets into the caves, into the mines with the bats. The bats are actually carrying them, and so they've got a vaccine that appears to be effective. But the question is, how do you give a vaccine to every bat across the United States? But there's some research on how we might be able to do that. There's other things about you can't just go into a cave and just start killing all the fungi, because there's tons of other species that live in caves, many of which don't live anywhere else on Earth. So you need to be really careful about protecting all the other critters. But what's interesting is whether a bat is immune to this fungus depends a bit on what bacteria are naturally present on the skin of the bat. So there's a lot of research into, okay, which are the really beneficial bacteria to have on the skin? Can we boost those bacterial populations in mines and caves? So there is research, and there's some promise. And in fact, in the eastern U.S. now, little brown bat populations are starting to kind of slowly creep back up. So it looks like we wiped out all of the strongly immune bats, or the strongly unimmune bats, and now the ones that were immune are repopulating, kind of classic natural selection. But they reproduce really slowly. So in my lifetime, I'm not going to see little brown bats or any of these other guys back at the levels they used to be. But no, so there are some hints that some bats will survive this. Some may not, and we may actually lose some species over this. But then there also appears that there may be some solutions that researchers have come up with.
So you alluded to this a little bit, but what do we need to do to make wind turbines less dangerous for bats?
One of the there's research into how can we make the turbines create noise that scare the bats away. So there's some research there, and the research has shown some promising results. But right now, the biggest thing that we can do is, ironically, bats collide more with the turbines when the turbines are moving slowly. So if you can not turn the turbines on until such and such a wind speed, you can dramatically reduce the bat mortality, but not really impact the amount of electricity that's being produced too dramatically. So the electric companies this one paper was like, you can reduce mortality by like 50, 60%. And the result for the electric companies like a 6% loss in electricity. So that's one of the things. Unfortunately, there are no laws that forces the electric companies to do this, so we kind of have to ask them to do it voluntarily. But some of them are doing that. So that's what's referred to as curtailment, not turning the turbines on until such and such a wind speed. And then also, most of the bats that die are dying during fall migration. So if we can know what nights there's tons of bats out tonight, turn the turbines off. That's another potential way. So I think there are solutions here for wind turbines. A, we still need a little bit more research, but then B, we need the wind turbine companies to buy into this.
So there's kind of some similar themed questions in here about what we can do for bat housing and any tips for urban dwellers for assisting with bats.
Right. Um, so bat houses are kind of a tough one. Bat houses are not super heavily used. If you like to do woodwork and you've got some wood, then yes, get plans, build yourself a bat house and put it up. Because I think probably the biggest advantage, the biggest benefit of bat houses is that it connects people to bats. And so makes us more aware of them, makes us maybe want to learn more about them. So those are all really good things. In general, the bats that you're gonna benefit with bat houses are big brown bats, who are already more common today than they probably ever have been in the past. So from a conservation standpoint, here in the Midwest, you're probably not benefiting them a lot directly, but you are benefiting them in that sense that again that you're connecting better to bats, and you can share bat information and the love of bats with your kids and your grandkids, et cetera, et cetera. So those are all great things. Um, but yeah, so there's so Bat Conservation International is an organization, and they've got some good information on bat houses, how to build them, where to put them. And then you could also just search for its just a second, best practices bat houses, because the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service just put out a really nice brochure on best practices for bat houses. So those two resources will answer most of your questions.
All right. So there's a couple water related questions. How does bat poop affect waterways? And I guess tied into that question was, have they been sequenced for like eDNA?
Um, So how does bat poop? Yeah, no idea with that one. One of the fun things about bats, it's a little bit frustrating, but also fun, is that there's a massive amount that we don't know about bats. So how does their feces impact waterways? Yeah, I don't think we know that. In fact, I'm sure we don't know that. But they do feed a lot over waterways, and so it wouldn't surprise me if there is some impact there. And I know folks are using various kind of eDNA from a couple of different ways, looking at their poop, looking at their poop in soils, that kind of stuff. So there has been some work, and yes, you can identify bats from their poop, and then you can also look at the kinds of, I should be saying feces or something more scientific, but poop is so much fun to say. But there's also been some work then on identifying what insects they're eating. You can tell whether they have white nose syndrome based on the DNA in their feces, all that kind of stuff.
What role can wetlands play in the recovery of bats?
Yeah, so there's that's I think is a good potential one. There's a number of bats, including some of the ones who are declining badly, that feed a lot over water. And the healthier the populations of insects are, the more diverse the populations of insects are coming out of that water, the better the food supply is for bats. So I think healthy wetlands and recreating healthy wetlands with good insect populations. I don't think there's any way we could actually, seriously study that easily. It would take mountains of work to study it, but I'm positive that would have an impact on especially little brown bats whose numbers are so far down.
All right, I think we have time for one more question. So we'll end on this one. Have you been to Houston to see North America's largest bat vortex? And do any of the bats from here go to Texas to do that vortex?
No. So the no is I have not been there.
Okay.
I now there is and I'm not sure if maybe this is maybe what they're talking about. There's a a bridge in Texas. I didn't think it was Houston though.
I
There's
think
a
it's San
bridge
Antonio.
San
Or not,
Antonio. There's a bridge there.
or
So I don't know if maybe that's what they're
Austin?
talking about.
One of the two.
Austin? Oh, well, a city
Someone
in
can help
Texas
us. Yeah.
has a bridge that has like 5 million species or 5 million species, 5 million Brazilian free-tailed bats that roost under there. And they come out at night and they just make this beautiful cloud that flies away. So no, I have not been there. But if that's what this person's referring to, then basically no, since we have very few free-tailed bats here. We have a handful of them, and those handfuls, maybe a handful of them, do in fact roost in that. But I don't think they use that bridge in winter. So I think they leave in winter. So no, I don't think any of our Iowa bats use that. If I'm talking about what you're talking about.
Yeah, a lot of people can confirmed it's Austin, Texas. So if you're looking
Okay.
for that bat bridge, it's in Austin. So
Right, that's
thank
the
you,
bridge.
folks.
And I see down there, yeah, Bracken Cave is another cave that has just massive numbers of free-tailed bats, as well as then the cave that's there in Carlsbad. So there's a number of caves across the Southwest with huge populations of free-tailed bats, but then they also often have 5 to 10 other species of bats that are roosting in those places. So they're neat places to explore.
All right. Well, thank you so much, Dr. Benedict, for joining us today. And you can find him. His email was in this recorded webinar, but you can also search Central College website and find his email if you have specific bat questions, or like you said, if you're looking for maybe identifying your bat, possibly Indiana bats on your property. Sounds like it's a good connection to make here. And I do just want to give a love shout out to your Bats Are Us license plate back there. So thank you so much. I learned so much about bats and hope to connect with you again soon.
You bet. Thank you very much.